Well, good evening, everyone. My name is David Van Zandt. I'm the president here at the New School, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's session as part of our Climate Change Demands We Change conference. I want to start out by saying how grateful we are to the advisors who helped us craft this program, to the speakers who are participating, in particular tonight's keynote speaker, Francis Beinecke. Francis is the president of the National Natural Resources Defense Council, which of course is one of the most important environmental action groups here in the United States. And also to thank our friend Dan Tishman, who will act as the moderator tonight. Finally, I want to mention the Kann Rasmussen Foundation for its general support. Climate change is a critical and increasingly urgent issue. Yet, governments, corporations, and the public are quite reluctant to change. In addition, while there's a great deal of research that has been devoted to issues such as engineering, architecture, land use, and other means of mitigating the effects of climate change, not enough attention has been paid to the ways that change is impeded by psychological factors, certainly money and politics, as well as our infrastructure here in the United States. This conference really aims to examine these issues. As I said, this keynote session is the third of 5. The conference does continue tomorrow with sessions addressing, first, how money and politics act as roadblocks to change, and then second, the difficult choices that must be made to foster urban resilience in the face of climate change. The topic of climate change is especially relevant at the New School. We have numerous schools, programs, courses, faculty, as well as students and staff committed to addressing sustainability and climate change. And our approach to these challenges has been really informed by our own core values. Those values are innovation and creativity, challenging the status quo, trying to figure out new approaches and solutions to solving problems, as well as the other core value of social engagement. The reason we do all this is in order to make the world a better place in which to live and for our communities. Our engagement in climate change here at the New School is also informed by our prominent strengths in design and social research. Design is at its heart about problem solving, innovating better structures, systems, objects, communication in order to improve the world. And social research ties in directly to that. The things we're talking about in this conference all have to do with the social bases for design and making changes in how we live. The New School is also committed to addressing climate change through its characteristic educational experience, which places a high value on cross-disciplinary collaboration, project-based learning, especially in partnerships with external organizations, governments, and businesses, as well as global networks. The most prominent symbol of our commitment to sustainability is where you're sitting right now, this building, our new university center. It is a leading building in the university world in terms of being sustainable. We have the LEED Gold status, and we're also trying to help New York City set a standard for green technology and building practices by offering this building as a learning and educational location for other people in New York and the nation to come and learn for. And so we're especially pleased to welcome Dan Tishman. Dan is the chairman and CEO of Tishman Construction. Built this building right here. He's also the vice president of AECOM, Technology Corporation. He is the chair of the board at the Natural Resources Defense Council. And he's been at the forefront of green building in New York City and real estate development for the past 25 years. Under Dan's leadership, Tishman Construction built 4 Times Square, which was the first green skyscraper in New York City, 7 World Trade Center, the first office tower in New York City to be certified under the LEED rating system, and, as I noted, this university center. Sustainability drives the Tishman's family philosophy engagement. They have donated generously to the New School's Tishman Environmental and Design Center, sponsored a number of internships for our students, and provided scholarships support over the past years. In 2006, Mayor Bloomberg appointed Dan to New York City's Sustainability Advisory Board, which provided expertise for Plan NYC 2030, which is the blueprint for greening New York City. And finally, Dan works closely with Frances Beinecke as the NRDC's chair. So I think it's all more than fitting that he is here tonight to introduce her and then to moderate our discussion. Dan?
Thanks, David. I'm really happy to be here tonight, especially now that the building is almost done. And we're standing on terra firma, not in water. I am very, very happy whenever I'm asked to do something with the new school because, as some of you have just heard from David, and some may know that growing up, the new school was my sibling. I realized at a very early age that my father had a third child, and it was called the New School for Social Research, which he devoted lots of time, as still does, to, and was, I think, extremely honored to have served as the chair of the university for many years. So this has been a very long relationship and one that fits, I think, very neatly around all of my personal philosophies, both in education and in direction, and also in around my dedication, and I think Frances's dedication to the topic of tonight, which, as you've heard, is is around climate change. I've always believed the New School has been on the leading edge of many things, and the heart of this, getting to the heart of this evening's discussion, is about climate change. But it's not about the scientific definitions of climate change. It's not about necessarily the legal definition of climate change, but it is about the word heart. Because at the end of the day, I think what you may have heard about today, what you're going to hear a little bit from Frances, is that I personally believe that the ultimate solution from climate change is going to come from within everybody. And as soon as everybody feels that there is truly a need to both adapt their lives and push the lives of the people around them, who will then in turn push the legislators and move in an advocacy position, that it will be then that we really have resolved many of the issues around climate change. It gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce my very good friend Frances. For a number of years, Frances has been my boss as the president of the Natural Resources Defense Council, and me as the board chair. It is a wonderful working relationship. We have been, for years, extremely proud to have Frances leading our organization. She is a true NGO success story and model, a person who came to an organization 40 years ago and essentially started in the mailroom and built her personal resume and reputation to being truly one of the great environmental leaders and champions in the country. She recruited me, along with John Adams, back in 1996 to join the board. I had no idea why they wanted a young construction executive to join the ranks of an environmental NGO, but I really do understand now why that was. It was very important to bring people at the moment from outside of the movement to inside the movement. It was a brilliant move, as many of the things that Frances has done over her career. Frances has had many accomplishments, too many for me to say how proud I am of, but one that is sticks out in my mind is that Frances was impressed into service a very few years ago by President Obama when the BP oil spill happened in the Gulf. And we realized when Frances was discussing the the great opportunity, but also the great disruption that it might cause to NRDC, because it was going to require a lot of time on her part. That there was no doubt on the board's mind that this was not only something that was important for Frances, but incredibly important for the environmental movement, because it was acknowledged by the executive branch that if Frances didn't agree to serve on the board, that it would be absent a person from the environmental movement. And so it was a great credit to her and the dedication she's had to solving many problems in the environmental movement, but most notably her leadership and dedication to solving this dramatic problem called climate change. So with that, Frances, if you would give us some words. I'll see you after your talk.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dan, so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you in the Tishman Auditorium. Dan is NRDC's chairman. He's a great partner of mine. He failed to tell you his very strong environmental background as an environmental educator, taking kids all across America, showing them the wonders of nature. So we knew exactly why we were asking him to come on the board and be our chair. It's also a pleasure to be in the John Tishman Auditorium. Through Dan, I've gotten to know John, and he has great passions as well. He's obviously passionate about this school and the importance of advancing critical public policies and civic engagement. And tonight I really want to talk about civic engagement, so it seems incredibly appropriate to do it in the John Tishman Auditorium. This conference, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here today, but it's an important gathering of experts and activists who are passionate about the need to confront climate change and determine the course for our joint future. Because we really have to work together to figure out what the pathway is for the well-being of human society and the world as we know it. The issue of climate change is one that I find deeply personal. It's an issue I've worked on for almost 20 years, maybe more. But it's also an issue of such global scale that it's really hard for people to figure out how to tackle it. But we do have to tackle it and stave off the worst effects that are being projected more and more often. And it's that challenge that I really want to discuss with you tonight. Diffusing the threat of climate change is an amazingly large undertaking, and it's one that I'm sure no one in this room underestimates. It requires nothing less than reimagining and completely transforming the energy sector of the world. And the energy sector underpins the entire economy. So it is the most transformational change that I can imagine trying to put in place, moving away from fossil fuels to a much more efficient, clean energy system. Fundamentally, the change must come from everywhere, as Dan was saying in his introduction. It has to come from companies, it has to come from cities, it has to come from countries, national leaders, and it has to come from all of us. Some of the changes are technological, some are behavioral changes, and all require a tremendous will to act. And I think it's that will that we're really trying to find. The hurdles to transformational change are considerable, but the greatest hurdles, I think, are the loud and powerful opposition from the fossil fuel companies, from the very well-heeled interests that are embedded in the system that we currently have. We see it constantly all around us in every advertising medium, in every talk show. It's an embedded challenge that we have to overcome. Secondly, there's just intransigence around us. It is hard to make change, and there's also a lot of complacency. It's hard to see how fundamental this challenge is, and it's motivating people to action is something that we all want to do together. But as Mark Bittman said in a recent op-ed, it's a matter of will, not one of magic. And I think that is where we really need to focus on. What are the solutions that are out there, and how do we get people to understand that they're achievable, that they're doable, and that they're inevitable? So do we have the will? Well, everyone here knows how urgent this issue is. And the recent IPCC reports that came out from the UN, I'm sure they were discussed earlier today. Every time an IPCC report comes out, it just tells us how significant it is to act now, how grave the problem is. I think fundamentally how serious the issue is from a humanitarian standpoint. Even though the IPCC is fundamentally about science, what they're talking about is something that affects people. And as soon as we make this an issue about the well-being of people, rather than how we change the energy sector or what the science tells us, I think we're going to have greater success. Climate change is everywhere around us, and we're vulnerable no matter where we are. Hurricane Sandy, which I'm sure you discussed earlier, clobbered New York. It clobbered NRDC. We were below 23rd Street. We had no power for days. I'm sure that was true of the new school as well. It was quite astonishing to really recognize how fundamental the impacts could be. New York University Hospital not only was closed down and had to move its patients out, but they lost years of valuable research because of the loss of power and flooding in that building, something that even though they had planned for a 12-foot sea level rise or a storm surge, it was 14 feet and caused tremendous damage. We all know what the loss of property was in Staten Island, in the Rockaways, in New Jersey, but there were lives lost as well, and I think those were the most poignant. The scale of the crisis requires sweeping solution that requires major policy interventions, because even if we knit together all the actions in companies and all the actions in cities, all the actions in state, it doesn't add up to the significant change we must make. First and foremost, the nation has to act. We need a national policy put in place, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And the largest emitters, the United States and China, have to step out front. We need nations to come together in an international agreement, but the biggest emitters have to take the first step. So NRDC is a policy shop. That's what we do. And for 40 years, we've designed solutions for some of the biggest environmental challenges out there. We know which policies will help us to fight climate change and reduce emissions. But in the deeply divided political landscape of the United States, which is awash in corporate money, smart solutions alone are not enough. We have to generate the political will to put them in place. We don't just need behavioral change, although we need that. We really need citizen engagement, and that's an area where NRDC has been focusing. We need a groundswell of public support for climate action. We need that from the grassroots, from the grass tops, from corporate leaders, from political leaders, from leaders across all sectors of society. And we recognize this because we've worked on other strategies for climate solutions, and we have not yet succeeded. In the 1990s, we spoke about climate change as a problem of the future and future generations. We thought that was right because the models were telling us it was going to be in the distant future. But that was wrong because the problem is now, and now we have to reteach that this is an immediate threat, not a threat of the future. In 2009 and 2010, we worked hard to get legislation passed in the United States Congress, a cap-and-trade emissions program that would reduce emissions and get the United States on a climate mitigation pathway. That legislation did not pass. It passed in the House. I actually can't imagine that it passed in the House when you look at the House now, but it did then. But it did not pass in the Senate. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons, I think, was just the dismal state of the economy. It would have been very hard to get that heavy a lift at that moment. But the other was we didn't have as sophisticated a political campaign as we needed across the country to really allow that legislation to succeed. We needed that groundswell of public support. We needed to be deployed across the country, and we weren't. But we've learned from these experiences. We know we have to be more knowledgeable about what inspires people to act, how people connect with this issue. We need a lot more partners across all sectors, and we have to be a lot more sophisticated in how we communicate. We know it's not enough to be policy wonks, although that's what we are, so we're relearning how to communicate. By investing in research, the social sciences are helping us reach beyond the environmental community and connect the issues of climate change with people's lives. Today, I'm going to share with you a few things that we've done to put our research into action. And then in the question and answer, I welcome your own comments and questions on how to improve this aspect of our work. But first, I want to talk to you about the policy landscape, because that's what we do. Every IPCC report shows us that we are not on a path to stabilize the climate. That's certainly true for the US, but we have entered a new era where President Obama has really taken climate change on as a very serious issue, has developed a climate action plan, and has many steps in place for the United States to address the issue. And that's critical because all we have right now is his executive authority, and we have to use it. We can't wait till the climate change, or the atmosphere, the politics change in Congress where we can get legislation. Ultimately, we have to get there, but it's not possible now, and we can't wait for it. So the administration has really taken leadership steps. In the first term, they tackled cars. After many, many years of trying, we got a major improvement in the fuel efficiency of cars. Cars will have to reach 54.5 miles per gallon, which is a major step forward. I feel like this is an issue that we in the environmental community have been working on for over 30 years. But finally it was achieved, and the results from a carbon standpoint will be really significant. When this rule gets in place, carbon emissions from the automobile sector will be halved, and consumers will save $80 billion a year in their fuel costs from cars. So it'll both have tremendous carbon benefit, but a huge economic benefit for people too. Now the president is tackling the single largest single source of carbon in the country, which is power plants. 40% of our emissions come from power plants. So regulating the carbon from power plants is the single largest thing that we can do as a country, that the president can do using his executive authority to get the United States on a pathway of reduced emissions. So last June, I was at Georgetown University. Maybe others here were there when the president announced his climate action plan. I was saying to somebody earlier today, it was a very, very hot day, well into the 90s. He was speaking from the teleprompter. It was so hot that the teleprompter stopped working. I mean, it was just such a, we were sitting out there baking, talking about what the changes were going to be to the country because of the seriousness of climate change. And in a 45-minute speech, he laid out chapter and verse, every step that he wanted his administration to take between now and the end of 2016. And the most important is the one that I mentioned, regulating carbon from existing power plants. He will make the announcement in June. June 2nd is the expected date of how those regulations are going to be designed. That's a hugely important moment to get us on the pathway for climate mitigation, but don't underestimate what will then happen, and in fact has already happened, that the opposing forces have already started a major campaign, the National Association of Manufacturers, the Chamber of Commerce, the Koch brothers and others, to try to build opposition to the adoption of those rules. So we have a very intense campaign on the other side to get these rules adopted. The U.S. can reduce carbon pollution from these power plants by 30%, which is equivalent to taking 130 million cars off the road, and estimate reductions that can yield up to $60 billion in avoided climate and medical costs. And I think this is the most important thing, they're going to unleash new technologies, investments in energy efficiency that will ultimately save people money. We expect EPA to design flexible systems that will allow each state to design an emissions program that works for their particular energy mix and is cost-effective for them. And so we need, between now and then and over the course of the next year when the rule is under consideration, to build a major national campaign with tremendous public support across the country. We need to continue to provide the technical analysis that NRDC is known for. We need to work with the governors and the utilities in the states to design these plans. But critical to the success is mobilizing people. We've identified 11 leadership states that are already taking action on climate. Those are the northeastern states under the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and California, and a larger number of western states. But it's actually the states in the middle that we need. 11 leadership states is not enough to accomplish this. We need 25 states in the mix. So we're working in a number of states across the country that we haven't worked in before, but where we need to lay the groundwork to get these state standards in place. We have an engaged environmental community. Our whole community and all the organizations that we work with have made climate change our #1 priority, and that is a large number of people, but it's not nearly enough. And they're not necessarily in the right parts of the country that we need to reach. So as I mentioned, we've engaged in a lot of research to try to figure out, how do we connect with people? How do we move from preaching, which we're very well known at as in the environmental community, to actually connecting with what works for them rather than through their lens rather than through ours. So we've been partnering with a group called America that does psychographic research conducted by Strategic Business Insights to help us figure out how we communicate better, which is always a valuable way forward. So the first thing is, saying isn't doing. Just because poll after poll shows that people care about climate change, it doesn't indicate that they are going to act. They're not taking to the streets, they're not demanding action. So we have to close that gap between people who believe it's a problem and they say they want action, but they're not taking the steps for action. Also, climate action is often perceived as alien from people's daily lives and even elite. People who, like me, I happen to have solar panels on my house and I drive a Prius, but for a lot of people, that isn't the way they see their lives and they can't make the connection. And also, people want to advance. They believe in the American dream. They still remember Jimmy Carter putting on a sweater 35 years ago, telling them to turn down the heat and go without. And there are even people who weren't born 35 years ago who remember Jimmy Carter putting on the sweater and telling to go without. So, for 35 years, we've had this kind of mantle of, you're going to be worse off and not better off, and you're going to be miserable. And no one is going to join us if they think we're telling them they're going to be miserable. So we really have to change the way we discuss it with them. And the other thing is that one size doesn't fit all. Every part of the country is different. The effect of climate change is going to affect them differently. We can't assume that everybody sees it the same way. So similar findings like these are appearing in studies all across the field, and we're all working together across the community to figure out how to make this work better for us. Another important advisor is Tony Leiserowitz from the Yale from the Yale Project for Climate Change Communication, who's examined how people look at climate change and put it through the 6 Americas, which you may have heard about. There's the core group of the alarmed, the people who want to take action. He estimates that those are 40 million people, but not all of those 40 million people are going to take action. It's only going to be a subset. And then there are the concerned and the cautious, people who believe it's a problem and you can get to them, but maybe they're not going to take action, but they believe action will be taken, and they'll give basically permission to elected officials to take the action. And then there are the disengaged and the dismissive are those who believe it's all a hoax. And you're never going to reach those people, and so to be in a constant this is the science, and talk back and forth with the science deniers doesn't really help advance it, because you're not actually reaching the people in the middle who may be more open to connection. So translating research into action, we've taken the information and framed our messaging in 3 particular ways. First and foremost, we're trying to connect directly with people in their lives. Most people are juggling a lot of things. I mean, I'm an environmental advocate. This is what I work on every day. Most people don't. They have their own jobs, they have their kids, they have their parents, they have their bills. Their life is very full. Trying to figure out where this fits into their life is really a challenge that we have to take up. First and foremost, people in this country want jobs. And when we were fighting the legislation, or working to get the legislation in 2000 and 2009 and 10, we were told, and it was in the middle of the very severe downturn, jobs are #1. We started working on that issue, but we've gotten a lot more sophisticated as time goes on, because it is the pivotal issue. Environmental solutions and economic solutions have to go hand in hand. If they don't, we lose. So we've made a much greater investment to really document where are the clean energy jobs that are being created, and what are they? It's not just numbers, it's in congressional districts, it's what companies are building solar panels, who are the installers, where are the wind turbines getting manufactured, who's investing in energy efficient buildings, really documenting both specific companies, jobs, and places. So it's not just an abstract number. it is really translated into somebody's neighborhood. Secondly, public health. People care deeply about their own health, about their kids' health, about their family's health, and about their communities. And fundamentally, power plants spew out carbon pollution and other kinds of pollution as well. And the country continues to have major air pollution, health problems coming from air pollution and an asthma epidemic. So connecting in communities with health issues that they are facing each and every day and talking about what the solutions to that are, which are also climate solutions, is really powerful and persuasive. So just a couple of years ago, we were faced with a challenge in California. California has the leading climate legislation in the country, AB 32, and there was an effort to undo that legislation through a ballot initiative, Prop 23. So the thing we wanted to figure out is how do we connect with people on the climate legislation to protect it from being undermined by Prop 23. What had happened is 2 Texas oil companies were launching this initiative, and they were doing it on behalf of the industry. And so we started by talking about why the climate policy was so important. And we had a complicated message, which we often do, and it got completely drowned out by the advertising blitz from the oil companies. So we actually went into the research mode. And this was NRDC with a lot of other organizations and other partners, because in any of these issues, it takes everyone working together. No single organization solves any of these problems on their own. So in the polling that we did, it showed what I just said to you. Most people care about keeping their families safe from air pollution. People don't like out-of-state companies coming in and taking their jobs. People did believe that clean energy jobs were being created in California. And the climate change messages basically failed. So that was a wake-up call to us that we really had to change what we were doing. And so we enlisted very different messengers. The messengers on Prop 23 were not the environmental messengers. They were the clean energy business developers. They were the Latino leaders. They were the local politicians and the health officials from communities and neighborhoods. And the message research and the strategy really worked. Californians defeated Prop 23 2-1. More people voted on Prop 23 than any of the other elections on the ballot, including the gubernatorial and Senate races. And even the counties that had Republican dominance shot down Prop 23. So this was really significant. It was the first time that climate change was in a major public referendum in the country. And we sent a resounding message to people. When framed correctly, you could get public support on these climate change issues and win. So this is a powerful model, but it's California's model. So when we go into Iowa and Illinois and Michigan and Minnesota and Pennsylvania and the states that we're working on through the power plant regulation that's going to come out, we're not going to use the Prop 23 model. We're going to use the research to see what are the issues that connect on the ground in those states and who are the most persuasive messengers, and work with them in partnership to get those messages out. So lesson number 1 is to connect with people. Lesson number 2 is that people trust people like them. So I'm an environmental advocate. I'm a mother. I live in New York. I love the Adirondacks. I live along the Hudson River. These are all ways that I frame the life that I live. And everybody else has that too. And so who do I listen to? I listen to people that I know who think the way I do for the most part, except for when I'm trying to figure out this other thing, which is how do we connect with all these other people. Who we are defines where we go for our news and views, and increasingly we can narrow that ever more narrower, so we have to understand it better. People don't stray so much from their norms, but if you trust someone who's talking to you about climate solutions, you may engage in the issue. It makes sense. We trust what we know. That's why it's so critical to tap the right messengers. So I don't know if anybody here is watching The Years of Living Dangerously, which is the Showtime series on climate change that started a week ago. But in the first session, there's a very interesting story about Plainview, Texas, where there's a climate scientist from Lubbock, Texas, Catherine Hayhoe, who is both a leading climate scientist but also an evangelical Christian. And in a neighboring town, Plainview, Texas, the Cargill plant has closed because of the drought in Texas. So she goes to Plainview, and she gives a talk about how climate and the drought and her evangelical Christian values are connected. And her talk, and this is, in the film, resonates with the people there because she's one of them, and they recognize that she understands where they're coming from and where their concerns are. So last year we had Catherine Hayhoe into NRDC's office. Well, in NRDC, she's much more exotic than she is in Lubbock, Texas, because being an evangelical Christian and having Christian values is something that isn't as much a part of our DNA as it is there. But in talking to her, she really taught us how to think through the lens that she saw and why she was such a powerful messenger. And just this afternoon, I noticed that Time Magazine named her as one of the 100 most influential people in the country right now, because she has that ability to reach people. And that's what we have to tap. And every community has somebody who can reach them who's different, because it depends on what the characteristics of that place are. But getting to know Catherine Hayhoe and looking at how much impact she has in her home state with her community just underscores how important it is to find the right messenger. And recently we've been sponsoring events across the country that do that. In Lincoln, Nebraska, we had an event for farmers with the Nebraska Farm Union. In New Orleans, where I spent a lot of time as a result of the Gulf oil spill, we had an event with the New Orleans interfaith community where the speaker was Ann Milling, who's a founder of Women of the Storm, which is a very dynamic group of women coming together after Hurricane Rita and Katrina to tell the story of those hurricanes. They come up to Capitol Hill, they go to Baton Rouge, and they basically explain how significant this is. And now she's a powerful voice for climate change as she sees sea level rise forever changing the characteristics of New Orleans. And just this month, we've been sponsoring a campus tour by the Hip Hop Caucus, which brings in entertainers into the campus community to talk about climate change. They're much more apt to listen to these entertainers than they are to the policy wonks from NRDC. So I think we're learning bit by bit, and people are showing up to these conversations. There's 200 people here, 300 people there. Tony Lacerowitz told me that there are only 200,000 people in the Tea Party movement who are active. It doesn't take a huge number of people. It takes a motivated group of people. So if we can find those connections across the country, it's going to have a major impact. So lesson number 2 is trusted voices. And then lesson number 3, and I think this is really important, is to inspire and empower people, to show them that there really are solutions, that solutions work. And actually all across the country, I think you will see clean energy being delivered very dramatically, whether it's wind, solar, or particularly in New York City, massive investments in energy efficiency in our buildings. Mayor Bloomberg committed to lowering emissions from buildings in New York by 30% by 2030, I think it was. And there are major investments in the commercial real estate sector to accomplish that, because if you go at the biggest buildings, you get the biggest bang for your buck and the greatest reductions. So now NRDC is working with 10 cities across America doing the same thing. Part of the reason for that is to show where the jobs are, to show that a clean energy economy is going to work, and also to show that the clean energy is an inevitable and positive future for the country. There are things in the United States that were once seemed impossible, which became inevitable. Now women can vote, but they couldn't before 1920. Children cannot be put to work after child labor laws were adopted. African Americans across the country have civil rights that they didn't have for many, many years. And same-sex marriage has been adopted in a number of states across the country. At any one point in time, you would have said any of those things was impossible to achieve, but they were all achieved. And that's why we believe that we can get action on climate change once the impossible becomes inevitable. And we have to make the clean energy economy become something that is inevitable. We are showing where clean energy jobs are getting created, as I mentioned, and we're really documenting place by place. We've created a parallel organization with NRDC, Environmental Entrepreneurs, which is over 800 business leaders across the country who are actually creating those jobs. So when they go to Capitol Hill or they go to Albany or Sacramento, they're talking about providing jobs in those locations, in these states, across the country. And it becomes less of a policy issue and more of an economic benefit about how do we make this possible across the country. I was at a labor rally in Gary, Indiana some years ago with Tom Conway, who's the international vice president of the steelworkers, and he said, you know, for every wind turbine, it takes 250 tons of steel. And this is about jobs, because every time a wind turbine's built, many people are put to work creating that steel. It's about creating jobs in the country, creating well-being, and protecting the future of our children. And he brought the house down. I mean, if you ever go to a labor rally, labor leaders are amazing speakers. They're very, very powerful. So we've been documenting those jobs across the state and working on policies that are going to make that happen. Just today, after 5 years of work, New York State, the Public Service Commission, adopted a new solar policy that will allow New York to spend $1 billion on unleashing solar energy in New York State over the next 10 years and create 3,000 megawatts of solar power. That is a huge step forward in creating the possible in New York State, and we're really, really excited about it. So this is something that we continue to do, is not only show where the jobs are, but create the stories and have them told. So climate solutions are not, we're closing down the power plants of America. We're recreating what the energy future is of the country and creating opportunities that we can export to other places as well. When I began at NRDC 4 decades ago, as Dan indicated, every environmental challenge was very visible to us. It was pollution in our air and water. It seemed very challenging at the time, but because it was so present, there was a huge outpouring to address the issues, and we got it done. And I think we have accomplished a tremendous amount in advancing environmental protection over these 40 years. But now when we look at climate change, we're really facing such a planetary threat that we have to approach it in a very different way, and we need a much broader public to join with us. So and I think actually in my job, that's one of the most exciting things now, is to figure out how do we make those connections, how do we work with others for the same goal, but each of us is coming at it with a different lens, with a different intent. I'm speaking all the time to garden clubs, to business leaders, to mayors, to fracking activists. And for all of them, my message is the same. Speak up and become part of this movement. Engage in your community with the solutions that are going to advance climate change, because it's going to happen from the bottom up, from community to community, city to city, state to state. Eventually, we're going to get back to Washington, D.C., but it's going to take a while to get there. When we connect climate change to people's everyday concerns, we can show that it makes a real difference. When we create clean energy jobs across the country, we're now employing hundreds of thousands of people in a sector that a decade ago had really started. We're inspiring people to act to benefit their own lives and to engage in politics. And part of this is re-engaging what is the democracy of the country about. Citizen engagement is a very, very big part of it, and the only way we're really going to advance the clean energy solutions that are going to solve the climate challenge is through the engagement of citizenry. We at NRDC have a very important role to play. We do a lot of analysis. We have a lot of experts in the field, but we cannot accomplish it unless there is an outpouring of concern and a recognition that this is a problem that can be solved. It's a big challenge, but it also creates a tremendous opportunity. And looking at that opportunity, unleashing the opportunity, and getting the support to realize that vision is something that motivates me every day, and I hope will motivate all of you. Again, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and happy to answer any questions.
I'm going to start with the first question and then invite people up, and we'll probably go one side of the room to the other. And I'm actually quite happy to be in this position, because One of the first times I watched a session like this at the New School was during the Actors Studio, so I get to play the position of the questioner. Anyway, Francis, that was great, as we would expect. And I think you did a great job of talking about how, this is really an issue that we each have to address ourselves. Do you have a sense for the people in this audience, knowing that we're sitting in an academic institution, is there, in your mind, sort of low-hanging fruit that people can start advocating for or dealing with in their lives to create the groundswell?
I shouldn't even say this to you, but the fastest, cheapest way to address the issue is energy efficiency. And energy efficiency, everybody can engage in, because it can be the car you drive, the appliance you buy, the TV you buy, whether you insulate your house. I mean, there are just so many ways. And this is, I think, the exciting thing actually about the field. There are lots of opportunities for people to engage. And part of it is what Mayor Bloomberg did, which is Plan NYC and setting a goal for the city. But every building has a role to play, and everybody in every apartment or home also. So the lowest hanging fruit is advancing energy efficiency, and the opportunities are are both tremendous, and they save money. So it's a win-win on all counts.
Great. Well, I will start with the questions from the audience.
Hi, my name is Anna White, and I'm actually a nursing student at Hunter College right now, and I'm going to be the president of the New York State Nurses Association in Sandy's next year. But I had a question for you on the topic of writing policy for students who are interested in getting more involved in the environmental aspect. So the question is, are there legal precedents that we can use on a state and federal level that we can utilize as a prop for the implementation of legal action in our environmental movement?
Well, NRDC has a 40-year history in advancing both the laws and the implementation and enforcement of environmental laws. And most of our basic environmental laws passed in the 70s, and they have served us very, very well. They need amendment, but they're strong. There are new areas that we need to go in, and just looking, talking about climate change, we tried to get legislation, we failed. Eventually, we have to have a national policy on climate. It has to be done legislatively, has to set a price on carbon. My own evaluation is that's going to take until 2018 or 2020 to get to, which is why this carbon standard that the president's enacting is so critically important. Because if you look at the IPCC studies, you can't wait till when Congress gets around to it. You have to act first. The other, since you're in the health arena, which is really important and an issue we've worked, again, for 30 years unsuccessfully, we have a basic statute, the Toxic Substances Control Act, that deals with chemicals in our society. The act is a failed law. We are actually in, Frank Lautenberg, the senator from New Jersey who recently died, was a champion to try to get that law finally amended and strengthened. So the burden would be on the companies to prove that the chemicals were safe, rather than making EPA determine that they were safe, which is the structure that we currently have. That is an enormously important statute that has to be amended. It affects people's lives, everybody's life. There are 80,000 chemicals out there in the world, then we don't know whether they're safe or not, or how you're getting exposed to them, et cetera. So, that's a fundamental, both the two biggest things that I see on the horizon where we really need new laws is in climate and in toxics. So I hope that answered the question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll go to this side of the room.
I'm Jonathan with a Revolution newspaper, and I have a question. This enormity of the environmental catastrophe that the UN report that you referenced, there does seem to be a yawning gap between the urgency and the severity of that on a global scale, or as like you pointed out, the humanitarian impact of this on the whole planet, and what the restrictions have been by a system based on profit. It seems to me that we have to break out of this framework and have a, go for a radically different world with a radically different system, a socialist system that is based on meeting people's needs and being caretakers of the planet. I'd like you to comment on that, please.
Well, I think, first of all, we do need a revolution in the energy sector. I completely agree with that. I also believe that we have to take the steps that we know we can enact now. So, we're fundamentally a pragmatic place, and I think we do need fundamental reforms, but as people try to achieve those, we need to adopt policies that reduce emissions because of the urgency of the threat. So that is very hard to do, and the only thing, with the amount of money in politics and the dysfunctionality of our political system, the only thing that I think we have to counter that is voice. That's why I think citizen engagement is so critical. And one thing that's interesting now, because so many interests, environmental interests, reproductive right interests, civil rights interests, feel stymied in the political process, there's a lot more conversation about working together on fundamental issues of democracy and not be so siloed in our own issues. So, we're very focused on getting policies for climate change because that's our #1 priority. But we're also working a lot more across other interest groups because we all need to work together to get the fundamental changes that you have identified as so important. Thank you.
Hi, Frances.
Hi.
Welcome. Thank you.
You're here at the New School.
Of course, yes.
Hello.
We're here at the New School.
I just saw an interview with you on
City op-ed.
City, there.
Yeah, exactly.
How are you?
Dan Tishman, Professor for Environment Sustainability. Thank you. We're really glad you're here. Welcome. And I wanted to point out in January that NRDC had a poll that said that the Latino population overwhelmingly supports strong presidential action in curbing climate change. Similarly, last year, the Joint Center came out with something similar for the African American population. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to really talk about all of the efforts that, in terms of democracy and working with different populations, that NRDC has really been working on in terms of broadening out the troops, for instance, Voices Verdes and other kind of activities, because I think that's really important that large environmental NGOs are partnering with the grassroots sector.
Right, thanks, Michelle. So yes, we have a group that Adriana Quintero on our staff, who leads our Latino outreach, has created called Voices Verdes. And what it is, it's grass tops in the Latino community who care about climate change. And we had an organizing meeting just a couple of weeks ago. This is a very powerful group. In all Latino polling, there is a very strong sense of community. And when you look at climate issues and you think about what the effects will be on the ground in communities, it is actually a much closer recognition than you might think. So investing in the relationships with Latino leaders and the Latino leadership was absolutely pivotal in the Prop 23 case in California that I described. Michelle, you probably know more than 30% of the population is Latino in California. They're a very strong political base, and they actually made the difference in that election in a very significant way. So increasingly, when we're looking at what states we're going to be doing outreach in, and there's more and more activity in Florida, the Latino outreach effort is a very, very significant part of that. And I think that, this gets back to my original comments about, people want to hear from the people they trust, who their community is. And so we're working much more diligently, engaging in partnerships with across all sectors and demographics, because we're policy people. Maybe I hope we're persuasive to the policy people, but we hope that other voices are going to make the difference in their community. So this is an actually growing area of NRDC's work and a very important part. So thanks for raising it.
Hi, thank you. My name is Eli Green. I'm a sustainability consultant. I do a lot of work with buildings. So I kind of have a two-part question, if that's okay.
Maybe Dan answers it.
The first question is to you, Daniel. what do you see as the next step? You've already done some great LEED buildings, LEED Gold, I imagine LEED Platinum. Are you looking at LEED version 4 for building energy efficiency, or looking at Passive House, just kind of in the market? I'm curious. I'm seeing some movement towards things like Passive House, which is such a great leap forward for energy. So I'm curious if you're seeing that. And then, Francis, what do you see as being the Tea Party moment for sustainability or energy efficiency? Is there anything that you can imagine that would get the momentum going for these kinds of changes that are so timely and necessary? Thank you.
You want me to go first? Yeah. So, you know, the Tea Party moment, well, I look at it a little bit differently. The activity on the Keystone Pipeline, activities in communities across the country that are faced with fracking, communities that are faced with coal transports for coal export, there is an engaged citizenry around the threats of fossil fuel development that has just, you know, blown forth in the last 2 or 3 years across the United States. I mean, it is a growing and powerful base. And increasingly, in the solar bill that I mentioned in New York today, that's a great example. There's a very active fractivist-based anti-fracking in New York, and those voices have pivoted to we better advance clean energy because we can't have this kind of fossil fuel development. And they were a very important part of getting this solar policy adopted. We've been working on it for 5 years. It's been, you know, kind of a heavy slog, but it actually emerged today in a very successful way. So I think harnessing those voices, engaging on both with the threats, but pivoting them to the solutions is a really important part of where the engagement needs to go. And I think that more and more people are realizing, I mean, we have an abundant supply of fossil fuels that's being developed. It's completely transformed the country. But the on-the-ground effects are considerable, and people are very, very alarmed about it. So to take that alarm and pivot it to solutions, I think is a really important part of the equation. Dan?
So although this is Francis's show tonight, you know, I will tell you that I think
He's the building man.
So I think the two of the most important things that have happened in sort of my lifetime relative to improving from a sustainability standpoint the built environment. One happened quite a while ago, and it was the creation, invention, and mass acceptance of something called the Energy Star system. And we all probably, some of us may remember when that was started. If you don't know what it is, you will acknowledge it because it is the sticker template that sits on the front of every washing machine, dryer, refrigerator, stove, computer, and it's acknowledgement that that product was built in at least to a modern standard in a efficient way. And then the creation back in, for the commercial building sector in the mid-90s, the LEED rating system. I'm actually not that big a fan or supporter of rating systems. But I think what the LEED rating system did for commercial buildings and what Energy Star did for manufactured products was for the first time a training tool for the public that has now well demonstrated that making the right decision environmentally is also making the right decision economically. And I believe, as Francis has talked so much about dialogue today, that we have to solve the problem, we have to step out of this as an environmental problem, and we have to relate on an individual basis that this is a problem, this is a lifestyle issue related to how well we do, both on a health basis, and on an economic basis, on a job basis, and that those were two great models. And so I think those rating systems helped start a movement. There's no doubt in my mind that in the green building sector that it is a major advantage to build sustainability. And if it takes a rating system like LEED or new systems or lean or whatever, if that's the motivation, that's great. But at the end of the day, it is training people that making those decisions are, most importantly, because it's the easiest, if you can tell people that they're going to save money by doing something, they're more likely to do it today, unfortunately, than telling them they should do it because it means that it's that it's an important thing for the environment.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Eric. I'm a PhD candidate here, writing on responsibility and climate change.
You can teach us.
Well, I don't know about that. So you ended your talk, so my question is about metric and individual sort of experience of their effect on a problem as big as climate change. And so you ended your talk kind of with an appeal to, we can all start with energy. And earlier in the day, there was, maybe a kind of mockery of the idea that turning off the lights would, seriously help. So I'm wondering, individually like that, obviously it adds up, but then acting as part of a group, say like students here are actively pushing to get the university to divest of fossil fuels. So like these are two ways that individuals can kind of act, right? One way is by turning off the lights, but that can very easily be exploited by companies. Starbucks tells me to pat myself on the back because the cup I'm using is 30% less paper. So two kinds of metric, one collective and one individual. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
So I think it takes both. I mean, I think that people want to know what they can do. And the fact is now there are a lot of things that people can do in their own life choices, whether it's how they eat, they eat, lower on the food chain, or what kind of, as I said, appliances they buy, or whether they recycle. I think actually taking action yourself is motivating. But it isn't enough, because basically we do need national policy. This requires, as I said in the beginning, fundamental change in the way energy is designed and created and delivered. Just so fundamental that has to be done at the policy level. But I don't think we'll ever have the policy will if we don't have an engaged citizenry and people engage on both a personal level and in their community, and then hopefully translate that into some kind of political engagement. So I think it's a step process. I really do. I think, again, it's sort of people connect with their tribe. So if you're in a student group or, working together towards a common goal is a powerful end. And I think it's motivating. I mean, I know, I was in college in the 70s, Vietnam War. We had, lots of things going on at the campus all the time. That created a political awareness for me, which propelled me into the public sector. And I think that today, people who are concerned about and motivating these issues will engage in every, whether it's through their church or their school or, a club of whatever interest they have that they belong to. But I think it can't all be, on kind of a high-level policy level. You have to come through it through a level of familiarity where you think your role has impact. And you can see what the impact is. I mean, that's kind of the great thing about the fact that more and more things are available. You can measure your impact. And it's not about turning out the lights. It's, what kind of, are you as efficient as you possibly can be? Do you have as much daylight? Are you putting in your compact fluorescent bulb? I mean, I think those Jimmy Carter days, I think in the 70s when he said that did seem to be the only alternative. People didn't know what they hadn't developed what the other alternatives were. Although I remember being with Amory Lovins in 1975 when he held up the compact fluorescent light bulb. I thought, does he really think that's going to permeate society? And now it's 30 years later, and he was absolutely right, it did. But you got to start somewhere. Anyway, and then get back in touch when your research is done and tell us what's really true. Then that'll help.
Hi, good evening. My name is Leah Eden, and I'm working on my master's in food systems, looking at food and farm policy. So my question is, you talked a lot this evening about the importance of relationships and connections, and I was hoping you could touch a little bit on the relationship that you see between NRDC and the good food community, specifically around action on the issue of climate change. And then specifically, what policy opportunities you see in the agricultural sector and the role that it plays in climate change.
So the agricultural sector is huge. And people think that maybe more than 30% of emissions come from the agricultural sector, and it's probably, it is the least developed of the policy arenas that are being looked at because it's the most diffuse, and also people need to eat. We need to grow food. So, trying to understand both what the climate implications are of the food systems and then attacking them is, I think, an issue that is beginning to be matured, but it's not quite at that level yet. So in the last 3 or 4 years, NRDC has really engaged a lot more on food policy, not in the farm bill level, because I believe there are a lot of other ways to engage on food without fighting the fight of the farm bill and losing, which is what happens time and time again. So, actually in New York City, we're working with New York and I think it's 6 other major cities on what the school food policy is with the major suppliers, where I think it's the 6 largest school districts in the country have joined together on procurement to have healthier food, more local food, more sustainable food. So we're looking at it both how do we advance healthy food, and then how do we look at what the consequences are on sustainability? We have a, what do we call it, a food index that we're working with the grocery stores on, so that if you go buy something, it's a sustainability index, sort of what the footprint of that product is. We've been working on that for several years. It hasn't quite gelled yet, but hopefully it will begin to. And then the other issue we're working on is meat, because raising cattle, the number of cattle is one of the least sustainable parts of the food chain. So looking at grazing practices and how cows are raised, whether there's a more sustainable approach, as well as encouraging people to eat less meat, is part of what we're doing. But whereas we've been working in the energy field for over 30 years, developing these policies and doing the analysis. The food side, we're relatively new to it, but the thing about food that's very evident is everybody eats and they care about their food. It's a point of connection. And I look at my own kids who are all foodies. One of them lives in Brooklyn. I mean, food seems to dominate, and where it comes from, the farmer's market. I mean, it's exciting. It's a way that people can see these issues without having it seem so overwhelming. They can engage too in the solutions and enjoy it at the same time. So there's lots of ways to tackle the issue. But it's a good question, and I think it's one that will develop over time. Thank you.
Hello, my name is August, and I work with divestment campaigns in New York State. And my question is about President Obama's policy of, I believe his goal is 20% renewables by 2030. And in my opinion, I don't believe it goes far enough. I mean, why not set an ambitious goal of like 100% renewables, all solar, wind, and hydropower, and then connect those to high technology devices that would increase the output? Potentially, it's outlined in a Stanford Energy Report by Jacobson. There's a path for New York State to go 100% renewable in just a number of years. I feel like we need to pursue ambitious goals like that because people are looking for these creative solutions. There are industries that stand in the way of that. How do we achieve 100% renewables and then just completely solve that part of the problem?
So Mark Jacobson's very interesting. I've seen him present on New York State, and we could have 100% renewables, a tremendous amount of solar and wind using the hydro that we have and maximizing efficiency. So it's physically doable. Both the economic and the political analysis of how that can happen create real barriers that make it more difficult than it physically is. But so as far as President Obama goes, he's the president. He needs to set goals that he thinks are far-reaching but achievable. And for others, like Amory Lovins, when he's talking about the compact fluorescent light bulb 30 years ago when I first met him, he's a visionary thinker. Bill McKibben is a visionary thinker on divestments. I mean, there are people who have visionary roles to set those goals, and then there are all those people whose job it is to implement it. So I agree with you that it's important to have far-reaching goals, but for example, the United States has made a commitment to reduce carbon emissions 17% by 2020. In the early part of 2015, they're going to have to make the next commitment. So everyone's examining what's that commitment going to be. It's not only what's the goal, you have to actually do the analysis, which we and a lot of other groups are doing now, to show that you can achieve it, what the pathway to achievement is. So I agree with you completely that you want to reach far because we do have to be fossil fuel free, but you also have to figure out what the delivery system is, and you have to build public support for it. So, I think that there are lots of, I think the goals should be far-reaching. We're hoping that this carbon standard will actually show that the United States can achieve the 17% reduction. It's not going to be easy, but I think we can get there. And then, I guess I've been at this for a long time, so I'm kind of an incremental, I'm a step-by-step person, and I see the steps add up over time. And when we try something often that's very far-reaching, and then we don't achieve it, sometimes I feel, that we're behind the 8 ball, we're less far ahead. So to me, it's sort of a balance. I agree with you, we need that we need to get fossil fuel free, but we also need the pathway. We need to show the pathway. So, I'm for somewhere in between. And I have to say, we worked for 5 years to get President Obama to take the stand on climate that we thought was really required. Last June he did, and there is a tremendous delivery mechanism now in place in the administration across all the agencies, which I don't think was there during the first term. So I expect that by the end of this, we'll see a lot more progress than we've seen in the last few years. But that only happens if there's accountability and really holding them to it going on and beating back the opposition. And nobody should kid themselves that the opposition isn't ferocious on this. I mean, it is so determined that we will not go down that pathway. And, but we're going to win. I mean, we're going to win because it's the way we have to go. But, I mean, it's going to be very hard. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Thank you. First of all, I want to foremost thank you for bringing up the idea of efficiency. A lot of people talk about moving to clean energy. They don't talk about efficiency. And I think that's vital because there's the amount of energy we waste between our personal use and the delivery system is kind of shocking. So thank you. And I, not meaning to be harsh, but I would like to hope that after today, nobody leaves here thinking it's okay to use single-use cups. So take your own mug to Starbucks, please. Put them out of business with their single use. But the point I came up here for was, I mean, I was a college student at the time of the Carter sweater incident. And back then, I don't remember anybody making a big deal about Jimmy in his sweater. People had...
Yeah, but afterwards they did.
Say what?
Afterwards they did.
I know.
I mean, we couldn't live it down.
I did not realize that until a couple months ago on NPR. For some reason, they were revisiting something or another. And they actually said that at the time, his talk and his presentation was very well received and it had a high approval rating at the time. But then at some point, the myth started changing and it started being a dismissive thing rather than an honorable thing. And I was wondering if you have any knowledge about where that went sideways and how we can be as effective as possible that we don't let honorable things go sideways.
Well, that's a really good question, and I think it went sideways when the Reagan administration came in, because Jimmy Carter actually put in a lot of policies on clean energy that if we had stayed with those policies, we would be in a very different place than we are now. But actually, I had an occasion to be at a dinner table with him at one point, and it was really remarkable. President Carter remembered exactly when President Reagan unraveled every energy policy that he put in place, because that's what happened. And it was, you know, it was the megaphone of the administration disputing that we needed to go down a clean energy pathway, and they created this very different narrative. And I think that, you know, creating a narrative and sticking with it is a very important part of this. This is why I'm saying that we can do all the policy analysis in the world, but if there isn't a strong narrative that goes with it, that people can connect with, it's very hard to achieve the result. And, you know, back in those days, and I mean, even until very, very recently, we just didn't understand the power of the narrative to the extent that we do now. And now we're, you know, communication is such a centerpiece to the whole discussion on any policy issue.
Well, along that, PBS just showed a movie, a documentary, The Fierce Green Fire, or something like that. It was just like 2 nights.
That's about the history of the environmental movement.
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't see it, but I know about it.
You know, and they talked about the development of the progression, and then they went by chapters or phases, and they showed Reagan. And they showed him just being really dismissive and sort of ridiculing. And
but he did more than that, because he was dismissive and dismissed the policies.
Well, right, but the media clip was of him presenting it like chiding those of us who believe that. So just affirming that the messaging is critical.
It is.
Thank you.
Francis, thank you for your really interesting talk. My name is Lindsay Sloat. I work for the Linden Trust for Conservation. We're an environmental foundation here in New York, and I'm a member of the Citizens Climate Lobby.
Great.
So my question for you is returning to the topic of far-reaching goals versus kind of incremental, near-term, achievable steps.
Carbon tax.
And you indicated in your talk that NRDC is focused on the practical, achievable wins that we can do now, which in this case is, you know, regulations under existing executive authority. What do you think it will take to make that next step? What is the kind of incremental work needed to get to a legislated carbon tax, either in the minds of voters or legislators?
So I think it's more to do with the politics in the country than it is the design of the tax. I just think, I mean, it's very interesting. In 2009 and 2010, we were actually very close to achieving legislation. I mean, when we look back on it, it's amazing how close we got. I mean, it passed the House, it didn't pass the Senate, but I think if it had gone up before Obamacare, before the Affordable Care Act, we actually would have won. Yeah. So it was sort of timing and what else was pressing at the time. So I think, you know, in national politics, particularly at the congressional level, there's a huge dysfunctionality going on. And on the House side, every environmental statute and program is under continuing assault. So you really have to see fundamental change in the electoral outcomes before you're going to be at the point, in my view, where, you know, you're going to get a carbon tax in place. That's why I said I think, you know, just looking at it and looking at the demographics of the country, which are changing dramatically. I was at a climate conference a couple of years ago where we had both a Senate, you know, kind of political pundit and a Republican and a Democrat, and they both said that the demographics would change so fundamentally that this lock on, you know, on climate deniers would change. And, you know, so could it change by 2016? No, I don't think so. I mean, so I'm saying in the 2018 to 2020 timeframe, I think the demographics, the electoral outcomes, and the reality on the ground of what climate change is demonstrating are all going to combine for a legislative outcome. But, I mean, it will only result if people demand it. It's not going to just happen.
Thank you.
We're going to take 2 more questions and we'll go.
Good, I'm glad I made the cut. I'm a new school student in the environmental studies program.
Great.
And I just wanted to speak to the notion of alliances and tapping into messengers. I kind of co-created a class called Student Environmental Activism Seminar and Practicum. And we look to past and current models of student environmental activism and particularly in the case of the past, alliances between civil rights, women's rights, anti-war, labor organizing. And I was thinking and hearing about 350 and the PIRGs and Real Food Challenge groups that have been effective at mobilizing students with on-campus campaigns, and particular to local issues, but still united under a name and under these campaigns. I understand that NRDC functions differently, but in tapping the right messengers, as you said, have you given any thought to student groups?
We have. I mean, we actually work very closely with Environment America, which is the environment PIRG group, and Margie Ault from that group and I chair the Climate Action Campaign. That's their strength. So, you know, they have a great network of student activism across the country, and that doesn't happen. I mean, we have members, we have over 1 million members and activists, but not in that demographic. I think it's the combination of all of them. I mean, I personally am very excited by 350 and Keystone because there's a lot of fire there, and we're not going to accomplish this without fire. So I love to see that. I wouldn't have necessarily guessed that Keystone would be the thing that would unlock that. That was a surprise to me, but I think it's fantastic because it's really resonated. And I think part of it is it's a project that we can do without. You know, so it's manageable, and the amount of intensity about it is just growing every day. I mean, there are people on the mall in Washington for 5 days this week demonstrating on Keystone. And I think that's fired up actually people across the country in other issues like fracking, because there's a level of engagement, a level of intensity that's growing, and we need it to grow more, absolutely more. I mean, it's been kind of quiescent for the last 20 years, but we need that. You know, when we were college students in the 70s, I can tell you it was very active, very engaged, a lot of anger, and I think anger is a big part of it. People have to demand that they're not going to put up with having the fossil fuel industry own our future. It just can't happen. So the more engagement, the better.
My name is Miles Aiken, and I'm an activist. And about 5 years before Sandy, I came home from living in England, and they were renovating the buildings in Harlem, and I blocked Sean Donovan or HUD from renovating my mother's building on the principles of climate change. So I said it to say not me alone, obviously, but there were people in the society that knew that we were going to reach this position. And Mr. Donovan and Mr. Obama are a little late, as you know. Al Gore is very perturbed with the president. My question to you is that, one other scene set, there was a question here this morning that I thought was quite relevant. A gentleman got up and said, we just went through this period where China had made a global acquisition, what it did, in fossil fuels, and we were buying all of the products that China was making. And the very learned lady on the panel said, I think very deeply about that, but I'm not going to turn out the lights. And I thought, oh, what a great title for this. I mean, we're going to turn out the lights. For me, that has significant meaning for the quandary that we find ourselves in, we're looking at. So my question to you is that as we visually see the increasing number of boat people in the islands that are about to go up in water, or a very lucid article was on the front page of the Times Saturday about 3 weeks ago on Bangladesh. And I had already been interacting with Bangladesh, but the number in that story was so dramatic that they were talking about 50 million migrants out of Bangladesh alone. My question to you is, as those, I found some money. As we see more visual evidence of the waters rising and people taking to the seas, what will that do to your comment earlier, which we all know, about this being a humanistic problem, because if we don't take them in, it isn't necessarily a humanistic problem or altruistic problem. And what should the United States do to assist any of them in the EEC if we should? So what should we do as the numbers of people hit the oceans looking for dry land? And as you know, just in Japan, they're becoming more vociferous. in the IPCC meeting, people are saying, oh, we don't want to hear this talk. You did this, meaning us. So what should we do, if anything, other than eat popcorn?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are lots of threads there, but first of all, the United States has to take dramatic action on climate because we're the largest historic emitter. You know, we're the second largest emitter now, but historically we put more carbon into the atmosphere. And I don't think other countries are going to act if we don't act. So that's why we're so focused on getting the United States to act. If you go over to the UN, where I was last week, you know, the small island states, they are desperate because they're disappearing, and they are trying to find where to take people. And yet they don't have power. You know, they are very small countries, and they're incredibly powerful at the climate conferences and everywhere else, talking about their plight. But I think it's not until it lands on your shores that people start paying attention to it. And you know, I think Sandy did that for us to a considerable degree if we take it out of Washington, D.C. In Washington, you're arguing about, you know, with climate deniers, not in the executive branch, but in the congressional branch. You know, but here in New York, we're trying to say, how do we make New York City resilient? And I think, you know, that's why I say this is a humanitarian issue. When you look at how this issue affects people's lives, people are going to get more engaged. We do have a responsibility to people across the world. I mean, I was at a conference 5 years ago where that, between, you know, kind of the north, the global south, that issue came so powerfully to me because these countries can't, I mean, basically they're bearing the brunt and they can't afford to make the adaptation, resilient changes that are required. So, you know, in Copenhagen, we made, Secretary Clinton made a $100 billion commitment towards alleviating those problems. And then 2008 came along and there's no money, and money isn't on the table. We have to figure out how to get money on the table. I mean, I think going into the Paris climate talks in 2015, we have to figure out a strategy to get money on the table. I don't know what that is, but I know it's imperative. You cannot go and say that the strongest economy in the world can't afford to help. It's just not a viable position to be in. So we really have to focus on that. It's not all public money, it's private-public, public-private, but we have to demonstrate a commitment and a responsibility to that. Just on the issue of China, we've exported all our pollution. I mean, what happened is we exported our manufacturing, we exported the pollution. The amount of emissions coming out of China from manufacturing, which is huge, is because they're manufacturing 80 to 90% of the world's goods. A lot of those are ours coming back here. People have to understand that. And actually in California, people are beginning to understand it because the pollution is hitting California. And now they're worried about it because they cleaned up a lot of their air pollution, and now it's atmospheric transport from China. I mean, that's not a good thing, but it does raise awareness. So, you know, these are very challenging issues, and you got to work on all fronts. But again, you know, I'm just saying that my message tonight is people who are experts in the field, whether they're in government or NGOs or companies or wherever they are, they have a really strong role to play. But they can't play that role if there is not a really strong citizenry behind them, because the power of money on the other side is just too great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Francis, for excellent talk, and also your willingness to answer so many great questions. And thank you, Dan, for being with us tonight. And thank you to everyone for being here. We'll start again tomorrow morning. So.